Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you all. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Peter Jennings. I assume most of you do know me because I see many familiar faces here. Welcome to the last ASPI event, public event of the year. In many respects, I think we've saved the best to last, to have Kim and Susie here to launch this rather handsome new publication, not only a work of the collected wisdom of Chairman Kim, but also the first in what I think is going to be a new series of selections from the Strategist, our online journal, immortalised forever in print. And it's a delight to welcome Kim back. From May of 2016 until July of this year, Kim was a distinguished fellow at ASPI, and at that time, briefly freed from the constraints of his ministerial, political and ambassadorial roles, Kim wrote with relish and spoke at ASPI events with flair and great enjoyment about Australia's defence and international security. And in the first issue of the Strategist Selections, we collect Kim's writings from the Strategist, as well as a quite lengthy afterwards as well, to present to you this evening. Now, I think Kim really doesn't need an introduction to an audience like this, so I'm not going to go through his biography in a temporal sense, simply to say that he is a person who has spent a professional lifetime being deeply immersed in the design and implementation of Australia's defence and security policies. He steered his side of politics through the global anti-nuclear unrest of the early 1980s to craft an approach to Australia's alliance with the United States, which still enjoys immense support across Australia, across Australia's political divide. Kim thought his way through the challenges of designing the right force structure for the Australian Defence Force. Excuse me. And largely this is the force we have today, bigger and better equipped, but still reliant on the alliance at a time when Washington has turned inwards. Excuse me, I'll just grab some water. Sorry, a frog in the throat at exactly the wrong moment. As Australia's ambassador to the United States from February 2010 until January of 2016, Kim had a front row seat to the Obama administration, the rise of Donald Trump, the political fascinations of Congress, the end of China's peaceful rise, and the return of a revanchist, high-stakes gambling Russia. Beazley was the source of the best informed advice on alliance management to 5 Australian Prime Ministers. Few Australians have been such informed observers of the United States and had such deep insights into the alliance relationship and the intelligence, defence and diplomatic mechanisms that shape Australia's most important international relationship. Now, Kim has once again returned to public service as Governor of Western Australia. And in some respects, I know, although that was a tremendous privilege and honour, Kim, he had just the slightest twinge of regret at leaving ASPI as a distinguished fellow, because he won't be able to vent forth with quite the degree of enthusiasm and gusto that we all know Kim likes to apply to his commentary on defence and international affairs. So this is really something of a privileged moment, Kim, which we're delighted to be able to spend with you and your wife Susie, to hear your addresses on your thoughts at the launch of the Strategist, the Strategist Selections. And when Kim has done, I'm going to moderate some Q&A from the audience as well. So with that, please welcome Kim Beazley.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, and I feel liberated. I've escaped. I'm here among friends. As I look around you all, there are so many here that I know. I'm also under some discipline, which is not a product of gubernatorial rank. It's a product of time, because I've been told I'm only allowed to talk for 20 minutes, so that plenty of time's left for questions. So I've had to quite dramatically alter some of the things I was going to say. Can I start, as you always do when you're governor of a particular state, by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and in particular their elders past, present and emerging. It's a privilege to be with ASPI. I don't know where we would be without it. It pains me to have to speak well of a creation of one of my political opponents, but they did a very sensible thing. And as time has gone by, ASPI has become really probably the most granular and maybe the only granular think tank that we have on the issues of Australian defence. Australians naturally gyrate to foreign policy, on which we're pretty good at, and we're pretty good at discussing it, and we're pretty good at researching it. And as we segue over to defence, we generally segue over on national strategy and then stop there. When it actually gets into the operational or the things that we need in our force structure and why, we're not too good. And there's really only one SDSC does a bit, but there's really only one outfit which does it with great persistence and appoints people to do it. And there's never been a more critical time for us now than we think through not just the basic principles of where we ought to stand on defence, but how the hell we do it. And what our platforms need to be doing, and how we ought to prioritise among them, and how quickly we actually have to move, which is somewhat more quickly than I think we've moved in the past. And we need a debate about all of it. And without ASPI, I don't think there would be a locus for that debate. So it's a privilege to be here with you. I'm thinking of the stuff that you're doing on cyber now for the moment, which is marvellous. There's nobody else doing there's a lot of people researching cyber in the universities around the country, but very few of the people bringing it together in a strategic context to discuss both the threats and the ways in which we answer it. And there is no document more important produced anywhere each year than the document that you produce on the budget. The Department of Defence does not necessarily know what is in the budget, but ASPI does, and that is it's important that somebody does, and can come through with an explanation which is without parallel anywhere in the world, and critical to us understanding how we actually get value for money. Because I only have a short time, I thought rather than try and canvass what I've written, I'd just tell you that which appears in the afterword is almost as up to date as anything I think at the moment. So when you read the afterword from that, take it as a speech that was delivered. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of things before we get on to question time, because I think there are a couple of elements of the environment that need to be understood. I'm going to talk a bit about Trump, and more particularly in the context of his survivability, and I'm going to talk about resources, our resources in particular, and what the challenges are for us with them, because I think we're in a very problematic situation. And I think after that, then we'll open up for questions. I think we have been roiled in, and not just us, but this region, as a product of two major changes of leadership amongst the countries which most affect us, our ally and the emerging power in the region, China on the one hand and the US on the other. As far as China is concerned, Xi is the anti-Deng Xiaoping, and our view about China still carries with it the hopes and joys and anticipation that we had when Deng directed Chinese policy. Xi is the anti-Deng. Deng was essentially about collective leadership, time-limited collective leadership, about moves towards constitutionalism so that the private sector could be mediated in access to government and government decisions and the ability to operate, not by corruption but by legal processes. And when it came to the private sector, it was to be encouraged to take the lead in developments in the Chinese economy. And as far as the military was concerned, China was going to hide its light under bushel for a very long time. Absolutely none of that is now represented by the policies pursued by Xi. Not collective leadership, but a time-unlimited dictatorship. Not mediated by the emergence of constitutionalism, but by the re-emergence of the party. Not driven by free movement in the economy and the emergence of the private sector, but by state capitalism. Not hiding a light under a bushel, but he himself coming into power, where his authority in large measure is centred on his capacity to survive as a result of his being able to sustain Chinese control over its immediate approaches and Chinese incorporation of Taiwan. This is a totally different situation from that which we could have anticipated previously, and it affects economic calculations by us, and it affects also the situation with security calculation in the region around us. I don't know whether the region or we have made yet the mental adjustment to how profound those changes actually are. The second is the United States. Trump is often purveyed or portrayed in the community generally as the anti-Obama. Trump is not the anti-Obama. Trump is the anti-Republican. The Republican Party, prior to Trump taking over its leadership, was what I would describe as the National Party, not the Nationalist Party, but they were the reliables. I remember back in the 1980s when we were handling our relationship with the Reagan administration. Privately, Bob Hawke used to say to me, you know, our hearts, our values and the rest of it are essentially with the American Democratic Party. But the reality is that the country needs the positions adopted by the Republican Party, which were the Republicans stood for American leadership of an alliance system and sustaining that alliance system effectively. The Republicans also stood for a defence force that would be capable of operating in support of that alliance system. The Republicans stood for the rules, but what we now call, but did not call then, the rules-based order. So the Republicans also stood for free trade, and Australia does not really survive economically without the spread of free trade sentiment throughout the management of the global economy. So Hawke said, you know, we sometimes find Reagan hard to take, but this is what they all stand for. And he had a very good relationship, I might say, with George H.W. Bush. That is the party that Trump has repudiated. Now, that party sits inside, Trump's a whale, and sitting inside him is Jonah. And Jonah inside him is the Republican Party, and they are waiting for him to spit them out. And every now and then you go to it and sort of open the whale's mouth, and inside of this is a sort of faint chorus, so that when our folk go to OSMIN or our folk or NATO has to draft the media statement after the NATO meeting, what comes out looks essentially like what I described earlier on. The problem is it doesn't mean anything, but you never get a wrong thing said by Mattis. You rarely get a wrong thing said by Pompeo or Tillerson before him. You rarely get a wrong thing said by the various appointees to the intelligence community. What you don't get is any sense of confidence that what they've just said to you actually means anything. Now, that doesn't mean that they should not be engaged, because we don't actually have anyone else to talk to. But the truth of the matter is that you cannot even rely on, when a statement is made and a position adopted, it being sustained. One of the things that gives me in this enormous hope is the fact that you had Mattis's National Defence Strategy, superb. You had a substantial increase in the American outlays on defence, essential as we're going through a revolution in military affairs, which is vitally important to us as it is to the capability of American platforms. Trumpeting it, and I found that very encouraging that he did trumpet it when it was produced as his work. And then what did he do last week? He tweeted it had to be cut. Why did he tweet it had to be cut? Because he suddenly knows he is, in potential at least, in serious jeopardy at the next presidential election. In serious jeopardy because the fellow he appointed as chairman of the Federal Reserve and now tweets against routinely has decided there will be economic discipline, and if it is not going to come from Congress, it will come from him. And the likely consequence of that, in one after another of the American commentators on the American economy that I see, is almost no one is doing anything less than predicting a downturn or even a recession in 2020, which means that the Republican candidate for president is stone cold dead. And that's clearly being understood, at least by Trump, as far as that is concerned. Then you go to the election. I think we need the Mackerras pendulum. I think you want to put the Mackerras pendulum on the US political system for the 2020 election. Take all the candidates for the Senate, the candidates for the House, and the candidate for the presidency. Of all of them, even after this last election, who is the most marginal? The most marginal is Trump. You take a look at what happened in the last election. He lost it by 3 million votes, which is a very substantial defeat on the popular vote front. And he won it essentially in 3 states, in Wisconsin, Michigan and Pennsylvania. If those 3 states had voted Democrat like they normally would do, then he would not have won the presidency. Hillary Clinton would have won it. He won those states by around about 0.2 to 1%. So that's, in the Mackerras pendulum, puts you on dead centre as to whether or not you're going to go. And then you have the last results. Make absolutely no mistake about it. The last results were disastrous for the Republican Party. You've got to contemplate the setting. They have the best economy they've ever had. There is no unemployment in the United States. What there is now is frictional unemployment. Virtually anyone who wants a job now gets a job, but some people do want to change jobs or drop out of the workforce for a little while and take unemployment benefits for a whole multiplicity of reasons, and they're the unemployed. They're the 3% who are unemployed. Even real wages, which have not risen for 45 years, have just started to cheat their way up. To approach the midterms with this as your background, you start by thinking you're particularly terrific and well placed. I did get I'm afraid, the Trump election a bit right, and I point to a couple of articles in this which were pre the election, which do show some calculation, but I've got to say, I've just got the midterms completely wrong. To my friends, I was saying the net Republican Senate result would be between 6 and 8 seats. It was net 3. That in the House of Representatives, they would lose about 20, but just hang on. And they in fact lost 40, which is the worst they've done, or the best the Democrats have done, since 1974 in an election. And then I assume that, as normal, there would be, and most people are entitled to assume that, there would be a situation where youngsters and ethnics don't vote. In the 2014 election, after the 2012 presidential election, 20 million fewer people voted. The only regular turnouts on the Democratic side in normal numbers are white liberals, and that is about 20 to 25%. of the white community, but the ethnics and the kids don't, on the whole, roll out. And what happens? With all of this running, the Republicans there and at the state, I could have gone on to talk about 7 losses of governors or the 300-odd seats in the various state assemblies that the Republicans lost. I'll leave those to one side. But there was only one reason why this occurred, and that was because they didn't like Trump. That was the only reason to vote against the Republican Party. You didn't like Trump. So Trump just cost the Republican Party, in the best of all possible election years, a very substantial position. And in those 3 states that we referred to earlier, the Republicans did not hold a single statewide office. So you've now got a situation where the election is there for the Democrats to lose. Democrats winning will will take Jonah out of the whale, and the Republican Party will be a different party. But things have changed quite dramatically, and the Democrats, I'm not sure, and a Democratic candidate, who knows, will not necessarily be somebody who automatically reverts to the sort of leadership positions that the Americans used to take. That's something we have to take into consideration. Now, resources. This is a totally different subject. But it's the resources we need to devote to our situation. We do need to devote resources because we are now in a worse situation, and the longevity of that situation looks like it's going to be for the foreseeable future than we have ever been. You know, in 1987, when I was responsible for the Defence White Paper, our GDP was greater than the combined GDPs of ASEAN and about 70% of China's GDP. You don't even do a comparison now in relation to where we were with China. And as far as the rest of the concern, Indonesia passes it. We're in the G20 now. By 2030, if the G20 is strictly calculated on the basis of the size of the economy, we will be out. I'm not sure that that will happen, but that's a challenge for future Australian political leaders. But the so-called correlation of forces that the Soviets used to say, moving decisively against Australia, that doesn't mean we don't survive. Look at how well the Swiss do with nothing in their operation. But geez, it means you have to be clever. So we are moving into a situation now, not where you can't rely on the United States. We're about the only alliance, part of the Western Alliance, which has emerged with pretty strong outcomes during this era. And part of those outcomes is because we ask very little of the United States that we don't pay for, and and strategic ambiguity in whether or not the US guarantees your security is fine as far as we're concerned. Strategic ambiguity kills NATO, but strategic ambiguity does not kill us. You know, if you wish Australia ill and want to do something fairly serious, it's a hell of a calculation that you have to make that the US might do something. If the US did do something, then you are DED dead. And so that is of value to us. The joint facilities, which are critical for the United States, including the new ones coming in the space area, are now, and this is a situation different from when I was Defence Minister, where the big issue for us was the questions of knowledge and consent. The big issues now is how much more can we make use of facilities that we are now using massively. The joint facilities are part of the Australian intelligence and the Australian military order of battle. So they're now critical to us, for us to be able to survive. So any thought of moving out of the ambit of the US effectively doesn't just de-defend us, it effectively blinds and deafens us. That's really not something that we can actually sensibly contemplate. But what we do have to contemplate is what we ought to be doing for ourselves, because the value that we have as an ally, particularly to the United States, is that there's very little trouble that we can get into that would ever cause them to have to make a decision about whether or not they would have to commit forces in a way that might endanger them of a possible strike on their situation. One doesn't know how much that is going to last, but it does last for a fair while. But what we need to do in an area where the economic changes are now translating themselves into military capability, we have to constantly rethink our position so that the capabilities we have, the operational scenarios that we devise, they can actually deal with what problems might occur and do it essentially from within our own resources. I see a lot of publications talking about recalibration of basically Australian defence, national strategy, military strategy and funding. And I've seen, I think, quite superb publications in recent times. Paul Dibb and Brad Smith come to mind in some of it. But there are others writing. Peter's written a fair bit about this. There are others writing about it as well. I have to give a little bit of a warning. And this actually imposes even more obligations on the thought processes that go into the acquisition of expensive platforms. And that's this. I do, as you'll find in the final afterword here, talk about lifting our defence expenditure to 2.3, but that's much less than other people are talking about, though it would be $5 billion a year more than we are spending now. And I do it because one has to be a bit defensive and prideful about these things. It never got above that with me. But it was that when I actually had the job, and it was also 9% of the budget, not 7%, which is what it is rising to here now. So we actually need to be back there, but you cannot do a hell of a lot more. When I was ambassador, and this is where I'm going to conclude and then take questions, I was the Americans had come at us with everything. Most of my life as ambassador for 6 years was spent in endless arguments about this and that. Not about general propositions, but the detail of things. We just don't see eye to eye, and not why should we? We have different perspectives and different priorities. But nevertheless, one of the things that they used to say to me constantly was our version of the NATO 2%, and their feeling that we were swinging the lead when it came to defence matters. And I would say two things to them. The first is, we are always going to support you where it is essential that you have that support. And I've got to say, there's nobody who's more helpful to me on that than Tony Abbott. When he reappointed me as ambassador, he became Prime Minister. He did his first visit to the United States. It was going to be disastrous. He was the anti-Obama. He was and the PM&C and Foreign Affairs did their usual magnificent brief, and they were hopeless in terms of him being able to handle what it was that Obama was likely to dump on him. So I spent half the night writing weasel words, took it round to him at Blair House. He looked at the weasel words and he said, "That's crap, Kim. I'm not going to say any of that and it's all going to be all right." And I said, "No, it's not, Tony. You are not going to be all right. You're going to be the subject of a full court press." And when we went into the Oval Office, there sure as hell was a full court press. And they had the Vice President, they had the Sec State, Sec Defence, the Intelligence Director, the USTR, National Security Advisor. Normally there'd only be 2 or 3 of them. But he got as the Russian Orthodox prayer book used to say, the full responsory. And Obama starts off in his elegant way and for his 10 minutes. And you could tell in all the things he had a little hook. And you thought, oh God, this is what's going to be about. And then he says to Abbott, before we get into the discussion on details here, Tony, is there anything you want to say? And he said, well, yeah. He said, firstly, most people come to see you having complaints about the US. We've got no complaints about you at all. Others want things from you. We don't want anything from you at all. But I just want to tell you that you're about to get into a lot of trouble in the Middle East. And when you do, we're going to be there in numbers. And the air went out of the room. Everything after that became sort of desultory gibbering and the gathering was over. And for months after that, whenever there was trouble in the White House, somebody would ring me up and say, "You never guess what the President said today?" No. He said after this, that or the other, and there are quite a lot of this, that or the others as far as Obama was concerned. We need more Tony Abbotts. Not a sentiment widespread in the country, but or for that matter in the Liberal Party at the time. But nevertheless, that's one thing I used to say, well, we're always there for you with capability. We're not a flag, we're a capability. But the second thing you need to understand is this, and you need to grasp this as Australians do. We have another thing in common with you. 25% of US GDP is in the hands of the federal government. About 10 or 11% is in the hands of state governments. The same applies in Australia. 25% of GDP is in the hands of the federal government, 11 or 12 in the hands of the states. You spend that on some social security and you spend it on defence, and then you spend it after that on sort of what you might call pilot projects or assistance projects for various things that the state does. What do? Well as defence, we provide through that 25% of GDP universal health care. We provide the bulk of funds to state hospitals, to state governments for state hospitals. We provide the pension, of course. We provide an array of social benefits for families, supporting parents' benefits. We provide a range of other social security expenditures for housing purposes, for rental assistance. And we fund the independent school system, which by year 12 is teaching about 35% of Australian kids and never under 30% for the rest of the time through, and you provide absolutely nothing. And in the US, unlike here, everybody goes to public schools. So here it's sort of 65 public schools, 35% private schools. In the US it's 90-10. So you've got a situation where our federal government has to sit and look at this cornucopia of responsibilities that it has and try to fit defence in it. It is extremely hard. After years of Maggie Thatcher's depredations in the British system, the British got down to 43% of GDP in the public sector. So we ran way behind or ahead, depending on your perspective, of Maggie Thatcher's Britain on ruthless pruning of our social system. Then you move out of Britain and you go onto the continent and you hit the Scandinavians and they're up to 65%. So this lot in Britain and on the continent are talking about 1 to 2% of a humongous potential operation for utilisation of the public sector component of their GDP. We have almost nothing, and yet we're at 2. So I do think, in a budget which must be now approaching about 500 billion, 5 billion is a small percentage of that, but it's a small percentage of a very difficult set of choices for a government where humongous numbers of very powerful people politically are looking for their 1% too. So that's all I'm going to say, and I'm very happy to open myself up to questions. I'm sorry it's so unsatisfactory, but if you read the book, you'll be totally happy.
Well, Kim, thank you. And it's always a delight to talk to you because I find when I do, you're the person that's more pessimistic than I am in the room. That's pretty unusual. I wanted to ask Kim a couple of questions myself first before I go to the audience. Kim, afterwards you talk about the need for constant rethinking, which I guess has always been part of strategy, but certainly never more so. Does that mean in your mind that it's time for, after the election, the next government of whatever political stripe, to establish a process for another defence white paper?
Well, I would, and I would think they would. I mean, governments do that. They probably wouldn't do it in the first year because the Labor Party has been fairly strongly supportive of the defence white paper that's been out there. And they will have a raft of priorities. But I would be surprised if they didn't do one by at least towards the end of the term, if not before. And certainly they'll be doing thinking about other aspects of it, because our world is changing so rapidly on the two fronts. The strategic situation is just being tweaked all the time. Now, history, which used to be slow, is now fast. And so you have to get to grips with that. I think there are a lot of big decisions that will have to be taken in equipment terms, but the really significant thing, which is going to trouble this government if it's re-elected, or the Labor Party if it's elected, is we used to talk about the revolution in military affairs. We now really have a revolution in military affairs. The previous RMA was a bit of adjustment. This one is revolutionary. Really revolutionary. And it may be a lot of the systems that we're acquiring are not right. I think there's one thing that we now have right that we've never had right before, and which used to be always troubling to me when I was Defence Minister. If all your calculations are wrong and you face an emergency tomorrow, can we fight from a standing start? In my day, the answer to that question was no. The answer to that question now is yes. The Australian Air Force is the nearest thing to a fifth generation Air Force that any country on earth has, and all the trend lines for what's coming into it are good. So we have, and if you're thinking that essentially we're moving closer and closer to asymmetrical strategies of our own, then the Air Force is absolutely critical to an asymmetrical strategy. So, yeah, let's see.
And interesting to note the arrival of the first two F-35s onto Australian soil today. Next question related to the first is about bipartisanship. Do you think that's at all fraying or at risk of fraying in the Australian context on defence and security policy, because the challenges are becoming so much starker and difficult?
Yeah. My impression of the Labor Party now, and it was when I was leader of the Labor Party, we want to the Labor Party, I can't say we, I'm not a member anymore, but we, when I used to be able to say we, they do want to limit the area of debate between themselves and the Conservatives on national security policy, and that includes defence. There's a lot of people that argue that defence is disbenefited by a bipartisan approach. But I think the Labor Party has worked out that it is not disbenefited by a bipartisan approach, and that's the best position for it to be in. Right. Now, it may be that if the Labor Party wins, then the other side will take a different view. But there's also always a consciousness that in the Labor Party that you cannot get anything through the Senate. There's nobody, so you've got the Liberals in office, there's nobody to protect them on national security. The other political parties in the Senate simply won't vote for them under any circumstances. So unless the Labor Party does, then nothing gets through. I think the Labor Party has slightly broader options in the Senate than the Conservatives, but all the same, they probably think a little bit the same way. There's particular reasons for this, which makes the Labor Party very different from other parties. It's not like the left parties in Europe or in the United States. I would say that the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party is to the right of the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives in the United States, and it's certainly right to the right of the Social Democratic parties in Europe. Partly it is because, unlike all of them, the Labor Party is essentially a product of Christian democracy. So the Labor Party I joined had three factions in it. One were the Christian Democrats. The others, that's not what they call themselves. They call themselves a right. But the other, the Christian Democrats. The other were revolutionary socialists. And the left in the Labor Party was strongly Marxist in that time. And the third lot were the Fabians. And that was the percentage basically like the British Labor Party. So it was in those days about 90% of the British Labor Party. In Australia, it was about 10 to 15% of the Australian Labor Party against the other two. But the Christian Democrats are basically reflective of the fact that this is a majority Catholic country. And certainly when it comes to those who practice their religious beliefs, it's an overwhelmingly Catholic country. And the Labor Party was overwhelmingly Catholic, at least on that right-wing side, which means they were not really capable of being seduced by Muscovite agents of disinformation. And that no longer, the Labor Party now is relatively united. The factions in the Labor Party are personality-based heavily and regionally based heavily. In the Liberal Party, they're ideologically based. The Liberal Party now looks to me like the Labor Party I joined. And so they are the ones who really have to work at being a broad church. The Labor Party doesn't have to work so much at being a broad church, but it's keeping everybody happy, and that's almost impossible. But that's a big difference. So I think that, as I said, I think the Labor Party will have to do a bit of thinking through on this. I think part of that's going to be due to the fact that what we now need in the area of hypersonics, direct energy weapons, satellite capabilities, cyber, electronic warfare, all of which we're engaged with the Americans in research, our weapons systems have got to be able to do totally different things from what they do now.
Kim, last one from me, and perhaps more about American politics than Australian, but one of the things I'm most particularly troubled about with regard to Donald Trump is the sort of acceleration of the end of civility in politics. And I mean, clearly I think he's a lead demonstrator of that feature, but you see it also in Europe, you see it in the UK, maybe here to some extent. Why is that happening, and should we be concerned, or am I imagining a false golden age of some time in the past?
No, there was a real golden age. Americans are vastly politer than Australians and vastly more courteous, and they're quite lovely to be among. And if you get yourself off social media, they seem to be 100% courteous. When on social media, the devil gets them. And so now, I mean, the civility has just disappeared wholesale. The worst statistic on this is one done by the National Journal, and this shows the ideological divide. And what they did was measure the numbers of members of the House of Representatives who sat between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. Well, in 1982, there were 344. In 1992, there were 237. In 1996, there were 137. In 2002, that had dropped to about 100. In 2012, 4. Now that's a really significant statistic, because the American polity does not work without bipartisanship. The system cannot work without it. And it no longer exists, and I don't see it coming back. I think what Trump has done is to take what is a divide that began and developed well before him, with campaigns associated with it which raised moral issues across the board, and turned it into a really crude, bottom-feeding level of abuse, mischaracterisation, encouragement in some ways of criminality in how people ought to be responding to certain situations. It has become dreadful, and I do think that if his administration goes, that will change, and that will change for the better. It won't change the ideological divide, but it might change the way in which people talk about it. There is no Trump in the wings. There is nobody in American politics who could get away with what Trump gets away with. He has triggered a feeling of disrespect and personal damage amongst an important section of American society, in the white working class, males in particular, but they're not a majority. And he's also triggered another sentiment. Last time, suburban women, educated suburban women, white women, narrowly voted for Hillary, narrowly. Normally, they would vote for the Republican candidate. In this last election, they voted 70-30 against the Republicans. So there has been a sea change in what is, it's not as big a bloc as the white working class, but it is nevertheless a big bloc that previously was a strong support base for the Republican Party. And the difference is there is nothing Trump can do that will change their minds. You know, the pleas of the fellows who had been their representatives for years to those women in the personal meetings, coffee mornings, public meetings that they had about they weren't Trump. And the women just got up and said, no, but you're enablers. And frankly, you know, you might have done well by us. We do agree with how you see the world and all the rest of it, but you're gone because a statement needs to be made, a moral statement, and we will make it. And they will, if Trump's their candidate next time, they will do it. I mean, it might be Pence if something goes that causes Trump to block out, and a lot of them would come back and vote for Pence. But then on the other hand, a lot of the white working class would not vote for Pence. They'd end up, so it'd be swings and roundabouts were that to occur. But the civility, well, I always thought that our politics was a roughhouse and the Americans thought it was too. But I've got to say that all the abusive things I used to say about Liberals and they used to say about me, we're not a patch on anything that goes on in the discourse in American politics now.
I've never heard an ex-Australian minister being described by a PM as dumb as a rock. So,
that was pretty good.
Well, over to you now for some questions. Please put your hand up and wait for a mic to come to you. This young man in the centre of the audience here.
Thanks very much, Kim, for coming all the way from the West to join us tonight and for the launch. And thank you, Peter, for a great year of ASPI. Staying right with the theme, so simple question, you got to a little bit there. Will Donald run, or will his ego be so big that the potential of losing will say he won't run? And if that's the case, what is the consequence for the Republicans?
He wants to run. That's all I can say. He's re-affiliated him. He's sort of made the declarations to allow him to raise money to put in place the re-election committee. I think his ego would determine that he'd want to run and that he'd want to win again, and that he'd take the view that the polls mean nothing and that he can win against the polls as he did last time. I don't think so, but that's what he would think. On the other hand, really, I don't know what's going to come at him. I can't understand why Muller hasn't been sacked. I would have picked Muller's sacking months ago. The longer he waits to sack him, the harder and harder it becomes. And the more Muller seems to have sort of rendered himself a bit impervious to sacking by sticking as much of what he's done in the hands of other people. And one of the really big risks for Trump is that while a president can pardon himself, family members, anybody else for federal crimes, he can't for state. And Muller seems to be putting quite a bit into the hands of state courts. So I don't think he could be impeached, but I can't see him being convicted. I do think if the Democrats spend all their time talking about impeachment, they will dismantle some of their capacity to win the next election, even though the temptation is so strong. But I don't see how you get a 67-33 vote majority in the Senate, where the Republicans, I think, have either 53-47 or 56-44, I'm not sure, 54-46. So I can't see a conviction, which makes it a fairly worthless activity when you've got so much you can investigate.
Let's have another question for Kim. Here's the mic just behind.
Hi, Kim. That's fascinating. Your insights into the Trump phenomenon are amazing. In the last election, the Democrats put up a very, very high-profile woman. Trump went out there and denigrated women, or evidence came out that he denigrated women. He talked about sexually assaulting women. He almost boasted about it. And yet he still got elected massively. How important is the result of this next election going to be? Will the Democrats' choice of a candidate be? Now, and who do you think that might be? Like, you've got Bernie Sanders, you've got... It just seems to be a very limited number of people being talked about at the moment. You know, Hillary herself. Do you have any ideas who might run?
Well, not Hillary, I don't think, though she sort of indicated something about that. I think, well, if you look at the polling, Biden's out in front by quite a bit. I'm not sure that the Democratic Party, as I said, has moved to the left of the progressives, would sustain a Biden candidacy. I think that it'd be hard to win with Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. They'd probably be candidates of Trump's choice. Most people would say, you know, all the cognoscenti would say that what the Democrats actually need is a sort of white guy from the Midwest or West, and they've got a few available. They've got a very good chap who was governor of Montana for a while. There are one or two others out there who fall into that, but I can't see the Democratic Party nominating them. I think the Democratic Party is now quite courageous about its minority ethnic status. I think they might well go for a woman or a black woman. I think that Kamala Harris in California has got would have, if she ran, a pretty good chance. She's a senator and she was state attorney general, and a very well-regarded one. She has the sort of atmospheric around her which is fairly able to appeal across the board. I think there's beginning to be a fairly high level of tolerance of Democrat nominations from other than the white community. I think you could see that paradoxically in Florida, where the candidate that the Democratic Party picked, a rather embattled mayor of one of the towns, an African-American guy. There's very few, the African-Americans are not thick on the ground in Florida. They picked this bloke, and I thought he would be absolutely smashed, but he only lost by 1%. So there's clearly a level of tolerance growing for the diversity of the Democratic Party. But they really would have to be careful in who they picked for that. And then they'd have to be very careful about their vice presidential candidate. I think a lot of people would bet on Beto O'Rourke for that job, who reduced the senator in Texas, Cruz, from a 63-37 majority to a 51-49 majority. He's not a candidate to be sneezed at, and he'd be a really good, rough in-house fighter against Trump in the campaign. But I think there's at least 20-odd probables as candidates among the Democrats, and God knows who would emerge. But as I said, it's theirs to lose.
So we started just a little late. I'd like to take a few more questions, and I can see one from Renee. So.
Hi, Kim. I have a Facebook from our live stream. Sorry, I have a question from our Facebook live stream. David has asked if you have any ideas towards Australia's soft defence or geo-economic defence strategy against a dominant China encroaching on her circle of influence.
Yeah, I mean, our defence problems are broader than just the issues of what China might be doing. And we really do have to concentrate most heavily on, I think, in our force structure on capability, what capabilities could be utilised against us. I think one of the strengths of the Air Force that Australia is now developing is that it is capable, it'd be nice to have a few more attrition aircraft, but I think it's capable of standing up against anything thrown at it outside a nuclear context. Folk warn me that wedge tails and in-flight refuelers are the things that in the tactical environment the Chinese and others think about having a go at. The bad news for everybody is the F-35. The F-35 is its own AWACS. The F-35 is capable of interconnecting with our over-the-horizon radar and the satellite systems which support us, and then vectoring the Super Hornets and the growlers around it. I think in air defence capabilities against anybody, we now have a very substantial position, and it would be difficult to think of China or anyone else in the face of that mounting an assault on us. However, having said that, I think we do need to think a bit harder and more carefully about ourselves. I actually think the most difficult thing emerging in our region is the possible consequences of global warming on the regional river system. The Chinese river system is drying up and will continue to dry up, and the headwaters of the Mekong and Brahmaputra are being diverted into the rest of the Chinese river system, and downstream in Laos and one or two other places, they're also starting to dam it. I think if the Mekong is reduced to a trickle, or say a third or a half of what it is now, Southeast Asia goes in about 20 years' time critical. And that's going to create all sorts of defence issues which I can't even begin to think about now. And then we look at ourselves. I'm now the West Australian Governor, so here's the only thing I'm going to say in a West Australian plug. West Australia is the most valuable asset any country has in the contemporary circumstances of the global economy. And that is not because of the gas or the iron ore or the gold. It is because of the rare earths, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel. West Australia has all the minerals in commercial quantities and quality capable of sustaining the fourth industrial revolution. All the minerals of lithium-ion batteries or batteries, all the minerals of magnets. And in the rare earths front, where China has a monopoly, and the US is worried, and I notice that they're incorporating that now in discussions, rare earths appear in 3,246 of the American weapon systems. And the Americans are totally dependent on China for it. We have more than enough of the various rare earths in Western Australia, some of which are now being mined, and that could supplant any cut-off of those sorts of resources, though you'd have to make some difficult, complicated picking winners mechanisms of getting all of that sort of stuff dug out. And then you've got global warming. There are parts of the globe that benefit from global warming. The vast bulk of humanity does not, but I'm not surprised if the Russians or the Canadians suddenly developed a disinterest in it, because the impact on them would be to massively expand the land available to them for agriculture and probably minerals exploration. Here in Australia, where we all live now, would be disastrously affected, but not the north. The north would experience a substantial increase in rainfall, and if you lifted the amount of that rainfall which is captured now, which stands at about 2% to 4%, then you would turn the whole of the north of Australia into a major agricultural province. And so you add those two things together, and we really are going to have something to protect. So it's a long way of getting, but I wanted to make those points, and that's the only question I think I'll be able to hang them off. But I would say on the front in regard to China, I cannot see a reason why China would want to have a go at us in that military sense. But if they did, then I think their calculations, apart from anything related to the Americans, would be enormously complicated by the capacities we're developing. In terms of activities on the intelligence front and the rest of it, I think we're getting on top of those issues.
I'll take a last question from Hayley Channer in the first row, Irene.
Hello, Kim. My question's about US foreign policy. When the US is thinking about foreign policy, do you see a shift in how it's thinking about the Middle East and Russia and Europe versus the Asia Pacific? You see Trump going to have a summit with Kim Jong-un, and also US, Australia, Japan, infrastructure investment in the region. Can you tell us what you know, and if you don't know, speculate wildly, on what US foreign policy is going to look like after Trump for our region?
If you take a look at their national defence strategy, you take a look at the things that they're focusing on. The Asia-Pacific region, or the Indo-Pacific region, I'm supposed to say, is now the most significant area to the United States. They're going to keep... Mostly they believe that. There is a pressure, of course, to engage in the Middle East that emerges from commitments to Israel. And that the commitments to Israel and its biggest impact on American foreign policy is not a product of American Jewry, but American evangelicals. Of the white community, the most strongly committed left democratic voters are American Jews. But the evangelicals are something else. And Israel is vital to the evangelicals, particularly those who believe in the rapture, which is 15% of them. Don't ask me to go into the theology of that. I can, but we'd be here for another half hour. Really, the Americans, even where the Middle East and Europe draw them in consistently, they really would rather focus on the Indo-Pacific region. That's certainly the way in which the defence leadership thinks, and probably also State Department leadership. There are lots and lots of bits and pieces of the European relationship and Middle East relationships which impact more strongly on the communities of particular congressmen, senators and the like. There's not a sort of community on the Indo-Pacific in the American electoral system, so it's a strategic judgment that's being made here, more than it is a political judgment. Trump himself is focused somewhat there. Yes, I think there'll be another summit fairly shortly, probably. Will it resolve anything? I don't think so. In relation to Korea, I don't think so. Is it a good thing that the American president is talking to the North Koreans? Yes, I think it is a good thing. But it would be helpful to have a really clear plan. It would be helpful if you're going to take on China on trade to have everybody else, all your other ducks in a row. And they haven't, because they're having a whack at Europe at the same time as they're having a whack at China. And when you look at the priorities in the president's mind on the struggle with China over trade is to the balance. You know, I'm caught up with the fact that 2/3 of global merchandise trade is in supply chains. You know, nobody produces a widget all on its own now, or hardly anyone. And you know, you wreck your supply chains when you do the sort of tariff regime that's being done. The main issue with China is cyber and intellectual property theft. And if you actually concentrated your blandishments on that, you might actually get somewhere with the Chinese on the trade issue. But you have to say in his defence, and I don't want to say all that much in his defence, he certainly got their attention, and nobody else has managed to for a considerable period of time. What will it produce? Probably not much, because partly it's interesting watching Trump set his advisors going, set Pompeo going, set Mattis going, set Kudlow going, set Mnuchin going. They all are quite rational. Or the USTR, Lighthizer in particular, he's got one fellow of genius in Lighthizer in the USTR. He is the most dangerous American trade negotiator ever to exist. A very difficult man to deal with, but God, he knows things. And he's a very capable negotiator, Lighthizer. So he sets them all running. And then a week later, he'll come out with a desire just to get something that he can sell his base. I think one of the things he's learning is that the base selling thing works for about 24 hours now. And you start to get into a bit of trouble very quickly if you actually haven't delivered on what it is you're saying. And I think on the Chinese case and the North Korean case, he's going to find that very difficult. What he is doing is forcing all of us to mature. He's forcing us to take control of our policy in our areas. We're lucky in Abe I don't know if Abe is just a one-off in Japan, but Abe is playing this about as astutely as anyone can and playing a real leadership role. And there are other people around who are fairly good. Europe, I think they're in a world of hurt, frankly. If you ever want to be thankful for the way in which we did reform in the 1980s, look at contemporary Europe. Europe and we did the same things, including Maggie Thatcher's Britain. Here, when it was done, enormous effort was put into the damaged section of the community, with social benefits, with things like super, with training programs, with assistance to industry for retraining and for repositioning of employees. That was what we did. They did not do that in Europe, and they did not do that in Britain. And the consequence of that is the yellow shirts in France, and the working class in the United States. They've finally arrived at the position that they're not going to be lectured anymore on anybody else's prosperity, which to them just seems to produce huge benefits for those who run the leadership of the companies. Remember this, that in 1975, the difference between an operative on the floor and the CEO was 30 to 1 in favour of the CEO. It's now 350 to 1. And they've had it. The working class has had it in a lot of places. And the working class in those places is capable of being induced into revolution. Not left revolution necessarily at all, but to fascism. So you've got a generation underneath of a proto-fascist attitude amongst many people of workers, and that's in Europe. So Europe is going to have to struggle with that, and it's completely distorting European politics at the moment. Makes it not easy for the Americans to deal with, even if they had a mind to. And at the moment, Trump is one of the forces that is destabilising them, not assisting with their stabilisation.
Yes, it looks like Paris looked in 1968, Kim.
Yeah, it does.
Which is quite amazing. Just to finish up, can you give me 2 minutes on what's on your 2 minutes, Kim? What's on your Christmas reading list, and what are your plans as you think ahead over the next year or so for writing?
The second volume of the John Curtin biography by John Edwards is on my reading list. I think that's absolutely superb. The rest of the stuff will be, ASPI publications, basically. And I think between the two of them, that's about all I can do, because I don't get a chance to read them during the normal day-to-day affairs, heavily at home. So writing, I may have stretched the capacities of a governor with the stuff in the afterword on that. We'll just have to wait to see how that pans out. But I'm thinking of going back over my papers and doing something about the Obama administration and the Indo-Pacific. But people want me to write biographies, but autobiographies, but anything interesting, I would say, has to breach 1,000 confidences, which I need to take to the grave, or else it would be unbelievably boring.
Well, Kim, I think I can speak on behalf of all of us to say we'd love to see you writing about your experiences of the States and the Obama administration. You'd have an audience here that would absolutely lap that up. Ladies and gentlemen, if you take away one thing, apart from a copy of the publication, if you take away one other thing apart from that, just recall Kim calling the next presidential election in the United States. The Republicans are dead. Who needs to be Anthony Green on the night when you can listen to Kim 2 years ahead of the event? It's been a fascinating discussion. I really hope you enjoy the publication, because there are some really wonderful pieces that Kim wrote in there. My favourite, the one after the death of John McCain, I thought you touched very well on so many aspects of his. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to thank Kim Beazley?
Thank you.